BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello everybody, today is Tuesday. On Tuesdays I talk to you guys about the story of JonBenet Ramsey, perhaps the most famous unsolved murder in American history. On December 26th of 1996, JonBenet Ramsey was found dead in her Boulder, Colorado home. She had a garrote tied around her neck, and she had been struck in the head with a heavy object. Prior to the discovery of her body, her mother Patsy Ramsey found a 2.5-page ransom note at the foot of the stairs, and everyone who lived in the house, including Patsy, as well as her husband John Ramsey and her son Burke Ramsey, went on to become suspects. And I've talked a lot about these individuals and the likelihood of them being responsible for JonBenet's murder in some previous Black Box Online Radio episodes. But I would like to talk about Gary Oliva as a JonBenet suspect, and he's one that I haven't devoted a single episode to on Black Box Online Radio before. I've mentioned him in some of these JonBenet episodes, but only very briefly, and some people simply do not want to hear anything about an intruder or some type of predator that was stalking the house and stalking JonBenet, and other people are highly entertaining Gary Oliva as a suspect. And perhaps, I might be going out on a limb here, but perhaps Gary Oliva is the most strongly considered suspect as an intruder whom we can actually name. Of course, you can always say that's just someone who flew under the radar that hasn't been publicly named yet. But before we continue, I would like to remind you that if you want to follow along with these weekly episodes about JonBenet, you can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about the JonBenet Ramsey story. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com, and I am your host, Blackbox Ned. And another announcement is that I'm trying to make Black Box Online Radio more dynamic. And last week, as well as yesterday on Zodiac Monday, I played an interview clip with Kristen Dottoni talking about her book Cryptology Collections. Also had lots of media intertwined into that episode. And some of the other segments, I want to have more Q&A sessions, as well as topics that can be blended in within a single episode, like a title story and then a secondary story, and of course responding to your questions and comments. So please stick around until the end, and I will respond to your questions and comments from last week about JonBenet Ramsey. So firstly, who was Gary Oliva? He was a sex offender who was in Boulder, Colorado at the time of the murder, so he claimed. And he was someone who was rather transient, but at the same time, he definitely placed himself in Boulder, Colorado. Prior to that, he was in Oregon. But this story really begins on December 27th of 1996, in the early AM hours, when Gary Oliva made a phone call to an individual named Michael Vale, and he claimed that he did something bad, that he hurt a little girl. He's calling and sobbing, and Michael Vale, who's gone very public with this, has said that he was like, "What are you doing in Boulder, Colorado? I thought you were in Oregon." Michael Vale was a former classmate of Gary Oliva, and they had actually been corresponding for 16 years because they worked on audio recording projects together. And he received this very bizarre phone call. And then Michael Vale continues the story by stating that he was sitting on his porch reading the LA Times, and he saw JonBenet's photo, and that she was the girl who was murdered in Boulder, Colorado. So that set off some alarm bells from him, and he has launched a very public investigation about trying to publicly name Gary Oliva as the murderer of JonBenet. He says from the very beginning he knows who killed her. But let's look at some things in addition to that confession. Gary Oliva would go even further by directly confessing to this in writing, stating that he had an obsession with JonBenet, he loved JonBenet, he was, as we've said, sex offender, child predator, someone who could have been stalking the household. He was someone who had this obsession with JonBenet, and he loved her, and he did it by accident. He overdid the physical force, and that ultimately led to her death. And that he said JonBenet changed him more than any other woman. And this isn't simply his own words. Gary Oliva did go to jail for sex-related crimes, and they looked at his computer, and they found more than 300 images of JonBenet Ramsey, including images from the autopsy photo. Then he went on to write a poem called The Ode to JonBenet. So you have somebody who is a sex offender in the area who admits to stalking this girl, who has admits to having this type of obsession with JonBenet, JonBenet, and he also is not just saying all this stuff. He was indeed convicted for the sex crimes and sent to jail, and he was let out of prison, shockingly and sadly. And I'm going to go over to an article from Newsweek to help us out, and this is written by Kayla Caldwell, just citing the source, called "Former JonBenet Ramsey Murder Suspect is Reportedly Missing Amid New Documentary." Gary Oliva, who allegedly confessed to killing JonBenet, is reportedly missing. The convicted pedophile allegedly claimed that he was responsible for the death of the 6-year-old beauty queen, writing to a high school friend, "I have never loved anyone like I did JonBenet, and yet I let her slip and her head bashed half in, and I watched her die." He confessed to other murders as well, but has never been charged. He was, however, convicted on a child pornography charge and sentenced to 10 years. After serving 8 of those, he was released from the Arkansas Valley Correctional Facility in Ordway, Colorado, on January 31st. Oliva is on parole until February of 2027, but per the terms of the parole, he is required to check in with the police, and he has not checked in since February of 2024, according to the records from the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. His last reported address was the Silver Spur Motel in East Colfax, Colorado. Okay, they granted him parole. I mean, can I just say that it looks like that was a ridiculous move. If he was sentenced to 10 years, he should have served the 10 years. Granting him parole and then he just absconds, he just runs away. I don't really get why they do things. A police source told the Daily Mail that Oliva checked in with them earlier in November, but that is not reflected in the state records. Oliva reportedly has a history of failing to report as a sex offender and has multiple addresses. Gary Oliva was arrested in 2016 after being caught with 695 images depicting child pornography. 335 were those of JonBenet or related to the JonBenet Ramsey case, and that has been corroborated by the New York Post. Gary Oliva had previously been arrested for assaulting a 7-year-old girl in Oregon and was a suspect in the Ramsey case, revealing in a 2002 48 Hours Investigates episode that he wrote a poem called Ode to JonBenet. The TV episode revealed that the sex offender was in Colorado at the time of JonBenet's 1996 murder and could have been by her family's Boulder, Colorado home when it happened. In 2018, a former classmate of Oliva's told In Touch magazine that days after JonBenet's body was found, Oliva allegedly confessed to him that he had hurt a little girl. In 2023, that friend, Michael Vale, claimed that Oliva had a fixation with knots and nooses as well as stealing art supplies like paintbrushes in high school. That led him to believe that Oliva had killed JonBenet, seeing as the murder weapon was a garrote that was made from the broken handle of a paintbrush and there was a knot tied. Oliva had also told the police that he had never harmed JonBenet and was never charged because the DNA evidence did not link him to the case. John Mark Carr, a schoolteacher, is another name that is connected to this famous case, as he falsely confessed to the murder and was arrested in Thailand in 2006. The news of Oliva reportedly being missing comes just as Netflix releases a documentary called Cold Case: Who Killed JonBenet? And this is where I want to kind of stop from the basic introduction about why Gary Oliva is a suspect in the Ramsey case. And I want to talk about some of the doubts that I genuinely have. And this is not devil's advocate. This is not me just playing the other side for fun. These are the genuine reasons about why I am suspicious of why Gary Oliva is not the responsible offender. And the first one is, he makes this phone call to Michael Vale, and he says, "I hurt a girl." If he has this obsession with JonBenet Ramsey, he doesn't list her by name. I know the timing is suspicious. She's found dead on December 26th. He makes the call on December 27th. But still, that's not a specific piece of information. That's not a specific statement that implicates him in JonBenet's murder. He just says, "I hurt a little girl." And this guy also has a history of targeting other girls. I'm just stating the facts. The second one is, Michael Vale appeared on Court TV on Vinnie Politan Investigates, and I do have to give Vinnie Politan credit for sharing multiple pieces of his own viewpoints, which I'll be discussing in this episode. But he's interviewing Michael Vale. Michael Vale says, when John Mark Carr confessed to having murdered JonBenet, he knew that wasn't true. And they're like, well, why do you know that that's not true? How do you know that that's not true? And he said, because he knows who the real killer was. It was Gary Oliva. Another problem, we have to question all of Gary Oliva's confessions now because both of them were not the killer unless there's some type of tandem thing going on, which neither one of them has admitted to. That means that these confessions are a lot less credible, and it shows you that sometimes people confess to crimes that they did not commit, even murder, even sexual assault of children. People confess to things that they did not do. And Vinnie Politan actually just said, because they were a little woo-woo on his show, he made some type of noise like that. I'll give a better answer than that, because they are deranged individuals. People like John Mark Carr and Gary Oliva would both fit into that category. And one of the biggest pieces of evidence that comes into question is actually not from Vinnie Politan or Michael Vale or from Newsweek or the New York Post, these sources that I've been talking to you about. It comes to us from John Ramsey, JonBenet's own father. And they're talking about how, all right, well, there is a lot of DNA evidence that was left behind after the murder of JonBenet. They have DNA that is found on JonBenet's leggings, or the long johns as they're referred to as. There is DNA that was found on the waistband of her underwear, and there was also DNA that was found under her fingernails. So there is a lot of DNA that's been left behind, and this is where the story gets a little bit complicated. And I'll get back to John Ramsey's comments in a second, but this is where I need to openly admit to you guys that I'm not completely clear on how Gary Oliva was eliminated by DNA. Now, some people think that, all right, he's a sex offender, they put his DNA into the system, CODIS and all that, and just simply, he was a negative match, so the authorities dismissed him as a suspect. Some people claim that, but when I'm reading these articles and listening to people on the television, they make very vague statements about how they know with certainty that that's actually what happened. So then John Ramsey goes on court TV and he says, well, maybe the DNA evidence wasn't reliable. I mean, she was murdered in 1996. Maybe that's not really his DNA, or if it is his DNA, I mean, they didn't have the best means of preserving it. Maybe the tests that they did were not the most reliable in some ways. Maybe we can't trust them. And I'm just like, whoa, wait a second, John Ramsey. The DNA evidence is one of the biggest reasons why people think that you did not do this. I mean, the people who think that John Ramsey was not the murderer of his daughter look to that, and this includes me. Again, no devil's advocate. That is something that I bring up all the time about one of the reasons why I think John Ramsey did not do this. One of the reasons why, it's the biggest reason why, there is DNA found in multiple places that did not match him. He provided DNA samples as well as hair, pubic hair, all of that stuff. And this is detailed in his book, The Other Side of Suffering, about what he and Patsy Ramsey went through after the murder of JonBenet and how they were questioned by the authorities. This brings us to the next point, and that is that, well, if the DNA is not reliable, should people put the spotlight back on you? That's one thing. There are other reasons why people have their doubts about John Ramsey. It comes to certain aspects of profiling, and it also comes to certain aspects of the opportunities that people would have had to enter the house. Because as I was watching these court TV episodes, I noticed some very, very questionable things that are coming not only from John Ramsey, but also people like Vinnie Politan, when they are saying that, how did Gary Oliva enter the Ramsey house? And they're like, the broken window in the basement. JonBenet was found in the wine cellar, which is a room in the basement, which not a lot of people knew about, apparently. Apparently the Ramseys did not talk about the wine cellar too frequently, and they went through Lou Smith's whole reenactment. Lou Smith was a retired detective who got on the case, perhaps the most famous detective to work on the case, and he did a very famous reenactment showing how easy it would be for an adult male to break into the Ramseys' house through a broken window in the basement. The window was actually broken by John Ramsey when he got locked out once, and if I recall, he said he got locked out in the summer, but JonBenet was murdered in December, yet they never fixed the window. That always seemed bizarre to me. And they're saying, well, an adult male can't fit in there, and John Ramsey said, well, I did it. Lou Smith did it. But there's some major problems that people have with this window story. According to police officers, they said that they did not think that the intruder went in and out through the window because there were cobwebs from spiders and dust that was on the window that was not disturbed. And if someone were going through, then there shouldn't be anything there. All that stuff would have been pushed out of the way if an adult male had been climbing through the basement window. And one of the explanations that was provided, again, by John Ramsey and Michael Vale, is that, well, maybe a cobweb or a spider web can be made relatively fast, maybe in the hours when the killer left, in between the killer leaving and them discovering JonBenet's body, a spider made a web or cobwebs formed. And I'm like, whew, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not saying that's impossible. I'm not some expert on arachnids or anything, but I have doubts about that. I have questions about that. And that appears to me to be somewhat implausible. So we have all of these stories that are coming from Gary Oliva. He seems like the type of person that would do this. He has admitted to other things. He's been convicted of other things. He has hundreds of photos of JonBenet on his computer. He wrote the Ode to JonBenet. And actually, I do have one comment about that. And I know that they're stating that that's an piece of evidence for. I don't necessarily think that writing a poem called the Ode to JonBenet is evidence of murdering her. And we have to look at everything, piece by piece, and step by step. And with this Ode to JonBenet, what that tells me is that he had an obsession with her. But again, as a standalone piece of evidence, that doesn't show me at all that he murdered her. So, I mean, I just want to be very clear about that. But he does seem like he's fitting all of these profiling characteristics. Now, let's entertain the possibility that Gary Oliva entered through the basement window the way that John Ramsey was claiming. And that's purely for that one discussion that they were having on him as a suspect. So then he gets into the Ramsey home. They're at the Christmas party, and they're claiming that he had this habit of stealing art supplies in the past, and also he really liked knots. You just heard that in the Newsweek article. Those are quotes from Michael Vale, he is trying to vilify Gary Oliva, but he does genuinely believe that Gary Oliva murdered JonBenet. Those things almost sound a little bit too precise to me. Those things almost sound like this is somebody who is locked into a theory. And now he's just rearranging all of his memories and trying to make it look like Gary Oliva was guilty. In short, he is not seeing the forest from the trees. In short, he is just seeing what he wants to see to put all of these pieces of evidence in order in a narrative that makes sense to him. So, as you can tell from the tone of this episode, I have some genuine doubts about Gary Oliva as a suspect in this case. And part of me wants to be just like, yeah, this guy confessed to it. Yeah, he had an obsession with her. He wrote out these details about how he hit her too hard and that she died. But my honest answer is the DNA didn't match. And also, his confessions are very vague prior to the written confession. People have also confessed to this crime, like John Mark Carr, so I'm not seeing anything that is extremely substantial that would vilify Gary Oliva. Doesn't mean that he is innocent, it just means that I'm not convinced as of yet. But overall, what do you think about Gary Oliva as a suspect in the JonBenet Ramsey case? And also, I have one final point. Handwriting. Now, they looked at a lot of the handwriting samples of Gary Oliva, and they compared them to the handwriting that was in the ransom note. And, on court TV, they put them up on the screen, and you can do your own comparisons. And I was looking at them with my fiance, and we were just both like, nope, I'm not seeing it. There are all of these differences in the handwriting of the ransom note writer and the handwriting of Gary Oliva. I think his handwriting is extremely different. But they brought two handwriting experts on who were both saying, nope, there's a very high probability. We're not saying 100%, but very likely that he did. Maybe they're seeing something that I was not. I think his handwriting has some very big differences. But one of the problems is, and no matter what documentary you're watching, no matter what true crime show you're listening to, people always have to provide these types of conditions or these types of disclaimers when they're saying they're looking at handwriting samples from people who wrote stuff with a pen, and then they're looking at handwriting samples that were written with a marker, and then they compare these things and they're like, it's going to come out a little bit differently. I mean, I think Gary Oliva has different handwriting, but part of me wants to just be like, all right, case closed, this guy did it. I want that. I think everybody who has followed the JonBenet Ramsey case wants to know who the killer was, and they want the killer brought to justice. No matter whom you are, you probably really want to know who was responsible for this crime. But I'm just not completely convinced that it was Gary Oliva. But I would love to know what you guys think. What do you think about Gary Oliva as a suspect in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey? If you disagree with me on anything, please put your ideas in the comment section down below. Give me the reasons why. Tell me what you think about any of my statements. And we have some comments that came in on last week's episode, and last week's episode was called JonBenet, the Police Suspicions, The Imperfect Murder. The Imperfect Murder is a series that I've been doing where I've been mostly responding to the book Perfect Murder, Perfect Town by Lawrence Schiller. And this is one that is laying out the things in a chronological narrative, laying out the events of the story in a chronological narrative. And that one was talking about how the police initially began to suspect John Ramsey very heavily. And we have a comment here from Dave Smith, who says, "The intruder came, wrote a note with Patsy's pen, and rummaged through the fridge, made a sandwich, had a beer, then made a garrote from Patsy's paintbrush, probably had a beer on the couch, then quietly slipped out after killing JonBenet without making a sound. Uh-huh. Ned, do you know why the police rejected John's hypothesis?" Well, I've talked about one major reason why they thought the killer didn't enter through the back window because of the cobwebs and the debris. There was actually a quotation that they brought up from Lou Smith where he stated that there was debris from leaves that had been moved around that looked like it had been disturbed, but I don't hear that too widely talked about. Other people also talk about how, and this is one reason why I'm not convinced the killer went through a window. I'm just going to be very clear about that. That's not Dave's question, but I don't think the killer went through the window because there was not a lot of disturbance to the snow that was around. I mean, if you just had a single footprint that was out of place, that might be something that was a little bit more reliable. There could be other entry points as well as perhaps even tampering with the front door in a certain way, but there also was a side door that would be more likely to tamper with. So the killer came in and wrote a note with Patsy's pen. A lot of people point to the fact that the pen was used, and then it was returned to the cupboard jar where it was taken from. The person also used Patsy's own notepad to do this. And they're saying, well, those are items from the household. Doesn't that suggest that it was someone who was in the household? Not necessarily, no, because of the following reason. The killer did not want Patsy and John to realize that an intruder had been in the basement. They're placing everything back the way it was so they wouldn't draw attention to themselves. I think the killer entered the house when they were at the Christmas party, so what exactly would he do with that? I mean, just like start rummaging things around, as you said. And I know it's satirical about, having a beer on the couch and so on. I know you don't really mean that, Dave Smith, but they're not going to make a mess. They're going to do something like leaving everything exactly the way it was on the morning of December 26th, so all that Patsy would find would be the ransom note, and then they're going to think that the ransom note is real. I've said this for years. This is one point that I stand by. I think the ransom note was a diversion. I think the killer used that stuff simply because they wanted to pass the time while they were waiting for hours for the Ramseys to come home, and then they placed the stuff back so everything looked exactly the way it was, so that the Ramseys wouldn't get immediately suspicious. And now we have a comment that came in. Oh, first, we have to truly answer the question. Do you know why the police rejected John's hypothesis? They actually have rejected a lot of hypotheses from John Ramsey, particularly the one that involved the person who had been attacking a girl who went to JonBenet's dance studio. They're just trying to focus their investigations in some complicated ways that I don't quite understand. They never arrested the Ramseys. They were certainly never charged with these crimes, but at the same time, they just viewing everything with insufficient evidence. NGC Cat's Eye says, if it was a small foreign faction, then no one would have been allowed to openly investigate due to state of security or the military contract with John's business. So of course the cops blamed the family. No kidnappers leave the kid behind. Every other suspect has been cleared to date. This case will never be solved unless the grand jury files are released. Well, I don't think there was a small foreign faction. I don't think that was a real story. I think that was a fictitious additive that was placed in the ransom note. And whether it's an intruder or somebody else, I think they made that part up. And that was just, again, a diversion. It's something that is meant to throw people off, almost like a red herring. So I don't really think that this is relevant about state security of the military or the contract with John's business. I think that that stuff is mostly relevant. So of course the kidnappers blame the family. So of course the cops blame the family. No kidnappers leave the kid behind. I don't think anyone tried to claim the ransom. What I've said before in the past is there is the suitcase that was positioned below the window, and I think that the suitcase was placed there because initially the killer wanted to place JonBenet's body into the suitcase. Maybe they wanted to put her through the window, but then they realized that she wasn't going to fit in the suitcase, so they had to scrap the plan, and that's why they chose to leave her there. But I think that they were trying to stage this as a kidnapping, make it look like a kidnapping, but I think the killer was well aware that JonBenet was dead when she was in the house. Sir Gerbil McIntosh says, I've seen it reported that there was something on the kitchen counter, like a pay stub or something, that had the value of $118,000 written on it. If that's true, then an intruder could have gotten the dollar amount from the document. Now, I haven't encountered that exact statement, Sir Gerbil, but I have entertained the possibility that it was someone who was familiar with the Ramseys household, and I mean, even though, guys, I've talked very clearly about how I've thought an intruder was responsible for this crime, when I'm listening to these Gary Oliva stories, that does make John Ramsey look just a little bit more guilty. And I'm going to read the next comment from Sir Gerbil McIntosh, where he says, I truly think John Ramsey believes that there was an intruder. If he knows otherwise, he absolutely fooled me. Well, it's not only you, Sir Gerbil McIntosh, it's also the profiler John Douglas from the FBI, who said, either John Ramsey's innocent or he's the best liar in the world. And I would agree with that because, he does all of these public appearances, nonstop for 30 years practically. So this definitely would be a very good case of lying. But when I'm watching these Gary Oliva videos and reading the articles, I'm just like, all of the points that they're making that should point toward Gary Oliva actually point toward John Ramsey. The DNA is questionable. The intruder theory is questionable. Nothing is disturbed. Everything is in the house. And John Ramsey's own statements, which I brought up in the past on some previous episodes, such as, he's the one who finds JonBenet. He brings her upstairs. He looked in the basement when he was told to look in the top of the house first. He's the one who made the comment, oh, this was an inside job. Not too many people knew about the wine cellar. Those things all look like someone who knew exactly what was going on. And, but then again, if you're just going to say the DNA evidence should exonerate somebody, well, their whole statement with Gary Oliva is that the DNA might not have been handled properly. The DNA might not have been preserved properly. The DNA might just be unreliable, or that the authorities didn't know what they were doing at the time. Well, that points back toward John Ramsey, and as you see, I'm trying to evaluate this information as honestly as I can. Matt M. says, the theory that the parents couldn't take her to the hospital because doctors would discover evidence of sexual assault makes no sense. By that logic, JonBenet must never have had a doctor's appointment in her life, or the family concealed the abuse. Silly. And this is referring to a detail that I haven't discussed in this episode, and that is that JonBenet was sexually assaulted with the paintbrush. And maybe, again, I'm just going to try and respond to this. You bring up a very good point here. The family doctor concealed the abuse. That could be one thing. The second could be, perhaps they thought if the abuse was extremely recent, like it had happened very recently, then there would be more evidence of it, and that was something that they could not cover up. People would tell that someone had been touching JonBenet in an inappropriate way very recently. Maybe that's how they were thinking. But, of course, that's not the theory that I go to with. Grunge Truck says, the ransom note sounds like an intelligent person trying to sound stupid. I'm not even... I can agree with you about 30%, but when you look at the ransom note, it uses words like attaché, and it uses words like faction, small foreign faction. That doesn't necessarily sound like someone who is trying to be stupid, in my opinion. If anything, they're trying to be weird, maybe they're trying to be confusing, and most definitely, they're trying to be intimidating. So, I would definitely like to know more. And Ed Edwards' ciphers is in the chat, and he says that he has a few ideas about the ransom note. Well, if you have any ideas or theories, please share them. And to anybody who's listening to this, please tell me what you genuinely think about JonBenet Ramsey. And I'm not going to say that John Ramsey is my suspect. As of now, he is not. And I am actually surprised that I don't think more highly of Gary Oliva as a suspect, as somebody who has been very vocal about how I think that this was an intruder. I think that this is someone who entered the house perhaps in one of the more discreet ways. I think the intruder was hiding in the basement for a period of time. I think that they expected that the Ramseys would not be home immediately, so they took the pen and the notepad, they wrote the ransom note, then they returned them, and then they were waiting to use that as a distraction or diversion when Patsy would come down the stairs in the morning, or John if he did it first, to find the ransom note, and then they're going to start calling the police and going through the procedures, going through all the details in the note, when in reality JonBenet's dead in the basement. I just think that this was a purely misleading set of clues that was left behind. That was all just dead ends. And I'd also told you that the killer didn't want to leave JonBenet there. He wanted to put her in the suitcase and take her out to make it look like a real kidnapping. It was a plan to get away with this. Now, why would they do that? Maybe they had seen too many movies. The ransom note does reference other movies when it's talking about quotations that could be linked back to films such as Speed or the movie Ransom with the whole "don't try to grow a brain." Those things could be someone who had been trying to act out some type of fantasy from a movie. Or what could also be happening is that this person wanted to just completely throw everyone off their trail. So they're going to think that, oh, well, this was a kidnapping, and then they just never got in touch with them, or maybe they had another plan about something to do with JonBenet's body. But I do not think that this was a real ransom situation. They never wanted the money. This was a sexual predator who wanted to target JonBenet Ramsey, and then they wanted to create an elaborate story to disguise their activities. One final note on Gary Oliva. A lot of the claims about him are coming back to the stun gun theory. And whether it's Lou Smith or Michael Vale, or people who are trying to say that there was this intruder who used the stun gun on JonBenet, now, this is something that I can directly answer. The authorities do not seem to believe anymore that a stun gun was used, but they think that Gary Oliva entered the house, used the stun gun on JonBenet, and he brought her to the basement, and he committed the crime. Well, the problem is, though, and to the credit of CBS and their documentary, they showed that a stun gun would leave behind very specific pink markings on the body that simply are not present, and it's quite possible that JonBenet was stabbed with something else, or she was prodded with something else, and that's why there are 2 puncture wounds on JonBenet's body. So I've also discounted the stun gun theory for a long time, and also, to the credit of CBS, they showed that a stun gun that would have been used, that would have made those types of marks, isn't silent. It would have made a large amount of noise. And I think if there was an intruder, this intruder was completely silent. They're just moving about the house on their tippy toes, more or less, trying not to make any noise. And I know, a lot of you are going to dispute this with me. A lot of you already have disputed this with me about how you don't think that an intruder was responsible. I'm not completely ruling it out. And I would also like to look more into the suspect who was attacking the dance partner of JonBenet, the girl who went to JonBenet's dance academy. That suspect, I think, might even be more credible than Gary Oliva. With Gary Oliva, I just have so many doubts. It doesn't start with a specific link to JonBenet. It's just about the girl. Then the DNA becomes like just a giant cluster mess when they're just sort of saying that, okay, well, who really knows any more about that? But what they did state is that he wasn't a match. And then you also just have all of these things that are just only circumstantial without hard evidence that links him to the crime. Well, that's all for me now. Anybody can write the show at blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan. And then you can contact the show also on BlackboxNed88 on Instagram and TikTok, which I mostly use to release shorts and reels about true crime cases. But any subject is fair game. And that will be all for me. Until next time.